A profound realignment is reshaping the global economic and technological landscape, and at the center of this shift stand China and Russia, two nations that have spent years preparing themselves for a world where Western dominance is no longer guaranteed. What once appeared to be slow policy adjustments has now become a full-scale transformation, touching everything from currency systems and trade patterns to semiconductor access and national security strategies. For decades, the United States enjoyed unparalleled leverage over global finance, thanks to the dollar's position as the world's primary reserve and payment currency. This allowed Washington to influence international trade, regulate global banking, and impose sanctions that could cripple an adversary's economy almost overnight. But as restrictions against Moscow intensified and the technological blockade against Beijing expanded, both nations concluded that relying on Western systems represented not only an economic risk, but a strategic vulnerability that could no longer be ignored. By 2024, this realization had matured into tangible action. China and Russia accelerated a joint effort to build financial and technological shields capable of protecting their economies from outside interference. What began as isolated initiatives has grown into a coordinated framework aimed at reducing dependence on the US dollar, bypassing Western banking channels, and developing indigenous technologies powerful enough to sustain long-term growth. The result is not merely a policy shift, but the emergence of a parallel global system, one with its own financial architecture, supply chains, and strategic priorities. Nowhere is this more visible than in the dramatic reduction of dollar-based trade between the two countries. Where once the majority of transactions required U.S. currency or Western-controlled payment networks, today more than 90% of China-Russia trade is settled in yuan or rubles. Energy contracts, industrial goods, agriculture, and technology components now flow through financial pipelines insulated from Western oversight. This marks the beginning of a multipolar monetary world, one where the dollar faces competition not from a single rival, but from an array of regional currencies tied to emerging economic blocs. But the financial shift is only one side of the story. The other is technological independence, especially in the semiconductor sector, the backbone of modern military systems, AI development, telecommunications, and global manufacturing. When Washington tightened its advanced chip export rules, Beijing recognized that the era of relying on foreign suppliers for the most critical technology had ended. China redirected billions into building a domestic semiconductor ecosystem capable of functioning even under maximum Western pressure. Russian industries, cut off from many Western components, began forging new supply partnerships with Chinese firms while accelerating the development of their own alternatives. This dual transformation has global implications. As China and Russia deepen their cooperation in finance and technology, they are not merely responding to foreign pressure. They are constructing the foundations of a new geopolitical order where Western influence is no longer the default setting. And while the United States maintains significant leverage, its traditional tools are facing challenges unlike anything seen before. This evolving partnership between China and Russia did not emerge overnight, nor is it merely a reaction to Western pressure. Instead, it is the outcome of more than a decade of strategic planning aimed at rewriting the rules of global influence. As the United States relied on its dominance in finance, technology, and global alliances, Beijing and Moscow quietly focused on constructing alternatives that could one day challenge the established order. Today, those alternatives are no longer theoretical. They are operational expanding, and reshaping how the world conducts trade and secures technological resources. The financial aspect of this shift is particularly significant. By settling most of their trade in local currencies, China and Russia have managed to create a buffer against foreign sanctions and currency volatility. This shift has allowed them to continue bilateral commerce even when geopolitical friction reaches its peak. For Russia, which has faced unprecedented sanctions targeting its banks, reserves, and key industries, this new system has become essential for economic survival. For China, it represents a strategic opportunity to push the yuan toward international recognition and reduce reliance on the dollar-based system that the U.S. has historically used as a pressure tool. To support this transformation, both countries have expanded their currency swap lines. These agreements allow their central banks to exchange rubles and yuan directly, ensuring liquidity during financial stress and enabling companies to continue trading even when global markets fluctuate. Such mechanisms were once used only occasionally, but today they serve as pillars of a growing order that prioritizes financial sovereignty over dependency on Western institutions. At the same time, both nations have invested heavily in creating payment channels capable of operating without SWIFT, the messaging network controlled by the West. Russia's SPFS and China's CIPs were initially limited, but over the years, they have grown more sophisticated and more widely used. Discussions are now underway to merge or interlink these systems, potentially laying the foundation for a cross-border financial network independent of Western oversight. If fully realized, this system could become a lifeline for countries seeking alternatives to U.S.-controlled platforms, especially those vulnerable to sanctions or currency manipulation. But finance is only half the equation. The other half, and arguably the more decisive one, lies in technological autonomy. When the U.S. restricted China's access to advanced semiconductors, it was not just attacking a sector, but challenging the core of Beijing's long-term growth strategy. Advanced chips power everything from AI research to defense systems, and without them, China risked falling behind in the industries that will define the 21st century. Recognizing this threat, Beijing launched an unprecedented push for semiconductor independence, pouring state funding into research labs, fabrication facilities, and talent development. This movement has forced China to build an entire ecosystem from the ground up: design tools, lithography systems, wafer production, and advanced packaging technologies. While challenges remain, the progress has been significant. Meanwhile, Russia, facing its own restrictions, has pivoted toward China for technological components, catalyzing a joint initiative that blends Chinese scale with Russian strategic need. The result is a growing technological axis capable of withstanding external pressure. Together, these financial and technological developments reveal a broader truth. The global order is no longer shaped by military alliances alone, but by the control of currency systems and advanced technologies. Nations that master both can shape global markets, influence political decisions, and protect their economies from external threats. China and Russia have understood this dynamic, and their coordination suggests an attempt to carve out a parallel sphere of influence, one built on independence, resilience, and long-term strategic ambition. As Russia and China deepened their financial coordination, the consequences began to spread far beyond their borders. Countries across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and even parts of Europe quietly started reassessing their dependence on the US dollar. The global financial system, which for decades operated around American currency and US-controlled institutions, was suddenly facing external pressure from a newly forming economic network, one that operated through yuan-based settlements, non-Western banking systems, and bilateral agreements insulated from Washington's oversight. For many nations, the appeal was simple. They wanted trade without fear of political retaliation. Countries with histories of U.S. sanctions or diplomatic friction, such as Iran, Venezuela, and several African states, saw the Russia-China financial architecture as a potential shield. Some began using yuan for energy transactions. Others explored ruble-based agreements for infrastructure, agricultural goods, or industrial imports. Each new shift, even if small, chipped away at the dollar's grip on global markets. Meanwhile, China expanded its digital yuan project. This new currency system, built on advanced blockchain-based technology, offered Beijing an opportunity to bypass Western banking networks entirely. It also allowed China full visibility and control over cross-border payments, something no foreign currency could offer. As pilot programs expanded into Southeast Asia and the Middle East, several governments expressed interest in adopting digital yuan settlement systems to reduce transaction costs and avoid sanctions-linked vulnerabilities. For Beijing, this was more than innovation, it was strategy. A digital currency under its control could accelerate the decline of U.S. financial influence even faster than traditional de-dollarization. Russia, too, began integrating digital payment platforms into its cross-border trade, especially after its banks were removed from SWIFT. The Kremlin viewed digital currencies, local currency swaps, and Chinese financial networks as essential tools to keep its economy functioning, despite Western attempts to isolate it. These economic transformations ran parallel to developments in the technology sector. While China was building new financial routes, it was also pouring resources into chip manufacturing. Semiconductor self-reliance had become a national priority, and despite facing major obstacles, China kept expanding its domestic production lines, improving fabrication technologies, and investing in talent from around the world. Russia supported this push wherever possible, turning to China for advanced electronics after Western companies withdrew. Moscow also began investing in domestic chip initiatives, though at a slower pace. Still, the partnership between the two nations strengthened their resolve to create a joint technological ecosystem, one less dependent on U.S. or European suppliers. This alignment was not accidental. It represented a calculated strategy to link financial independence with technological sovereignty. As the U.S. tightened restrictions on advanced chips, China and Russia viewed this as evidence that Washington was willing to weaponize technology just as aggressively as it used financial sanctions. The message was clear. Control over semiconductors and control over global payments were becoming two sides of the same geopolitical struggle. For many global observers, this marked the beginning of a profound shift. The international system was no longer moving towards simple economic competition. It was moving towards separate technological and financial spheres, each with its own rules, currencies, and strategic alliances. In this emerging environment, nations were gradually choosing sides based on long-term security needs rather than traditional alliances. At the same time, the United States recognized the magnitude of the challenge. Washington feared that if China achieved semiconductor independence and Russia successfully built a stable non-dollar trade network, the combined effect could weaken two of America's most powerful tools: its technological leadership and its financial dominance. Thus, as Russia and China moved to strengthen their partnership, the U.S. began mobilizing its own alliances. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and the Netherlands, all critical players in the global chip supply chain, tightened cooperation with Washington. New export controls were drafted, new semiconductor facilities were planned, and new financial coordination mechanisms were discussed. The world was slowly dividing into competing blocs, not through war, but through chips, currency, and digital systems. The next stage of this unfolding contest would depend not only on political decisions, but on which side could innovate faster, build stronger alliances, and maintain control of the technologies shaping the global economy. As these rival blocs strengthened their positions, global markets began to feel the effects of the shifting landscape. Investors, economists, and technology analysts noticed a trend that once seemed unthinkable. Supply chains that had operated seamlessly for decades were slowly fragmenting. Companies that previously relied on global integration were being forced to rethink where they built factories, which currencies they used, and which governments they depended on for stability. Multinational corporations suddenly found themselves navigating an era defined by uncertainty. Semiconductor shortages became common. Critical minerals grew more expensive, and geopolitical tensions made long-term planning increasingly difficult. A single policy change in Washington or Beijing could disrupt entire industries overnight. The world was learning that technology and finance were no longer just economic sectors. They had become instruments of national power. In this environment, nations that once stayed neutral were now reassessing their strategic positions. Countries in Southeast Asia, for example, were caught between China's economic influence and the United States' security partnerships. Nations like Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Thailand sought to diversify their technological suppliers and financial channels, aiming to avoid overdependence on any single major power. Some invested in local chip manufacturing. Others signed new trade agreements that allowed currency flexibility instead of strict dollar-based settlements. In the Middle East, energy exporters also began exploring alternative financial mechanisms. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Iran engaged in more discussions with China regarding yuan-based oil transactions. Although the dollar still dominated global energy markets, the growing willingness of key producers to consider other currencies signaled a subtle shift with long-term implications. Africa, too, emerged as a pivotal region in this global realignment. China's Belt and Road Initiative had already established deep economic ties across the continent, and now Beijing began incorporating financial tools, such as yuan swap lines and digital currency experiments, into its infrastructure projects. Russia, looking to strengthen global partnerships, increased energy exports and military agreements with African states, often settling deals outside the U.S. financial system. These actions further accelerated de-dollarization trends in regions that previously relied heavily on Western banking systems. Throughout all these developments, the semiconductor race remained at the center of the global transformation. The United States continued to tighten restrictions on advanced chip machinery, especially those involving extreme ultraviolet lithography, EUV. American policymakers believed that restricting China's access to cutting-edge tools would slow Beijing's technological rise. But this pressure only intensified China's determination to innovate independently. Beijing expanded state-backed research programs, recruited engineers from around the world, and poured massive funding into universities and technology hubs. Domestic companies like SMIC and Huawei accelerated their efforts to design advanced chips using older equipment, proving that innovation could flourish even under heavy restrictions. Meanwhile, new partnerships began forming between China and countries willing to exchange technology or raw materials without aligning with Western policies. Russia, though lacking China's industrial scale, contributed in other ways. It shared software expertise, cyber defense technologies, and advanced materials research, areas where it maintained strong capabilities. Together, Russia and China aimed to build a comprehensive ecosystem capable of resisting external pressure. This growing integration did not go unnoticed. Western governments understood that if China succeeded in producing competitive high-end chips and Russia maintained a stable non-dollar trade network, it would dramatically shift global power dynamics. The combination of financial independence and technological self-reliance would reduce the West's ability to influence global events through sanctions or technology controls. To counter this, the U.S. intensified collaborations with its closest allies: the Netherlands, home to ASML; Japan, a major chip equipment supplier; South Korea, a semiconductor powerhouse; and Taiwan, the world leader in chip fabrication, all entered deeper cooperation with Washington. Their alignment formed a protective ring around the global chip ecosystem, ensuring that China would face significant barriers in accessing the most advanced technologies. But even as alliances solidified, the world moved closer to a new era, one where multiple financial systems, multiple technological networks, and competing industrial supply chains operated simultaneously. Instead of a single, unified global market, a more divided and complex structure was emerging. This evolving environment suggested a fundamental truth. The competition for global dominance would no longer be fought with armies, but with algorithms, data, advanced chips, digital currencies, and control over trade routes. The next chapters of this struggle would determine not only who leads in technology and finance, but also how the world functions in the decades ahead. As global systems slowly drifted into competing spheres of influence, the pressure on developing nations grew stronger. Countries that once operated freely in a neutral environment now faced a world where choosing economic partnerships could also mean choosing sides. While some nations embraced emerging opportunities, others worried about being caught in the middle of a geopolitical struggle that was far larger than themselves. For many governments, the choice was no longer simply about diplomatic alignment. It was about securing access to technology essential for modern development. High-performance chips powered everything from telecommunications to transportation, from financial analysis to national security. The nation that offered the most reliable technological ecosystem would inevitably attract those seeking stability amid global fragmentation. China recognized this advantage early. Through initiatives like the Digital Silk Road, Beijing expanded infrastructure investments in dozens of countries, building data centers, 5G networks, cloud platforms, and AI powerhouses. These partnerships often included financing options that allowed nations to bypass dollar-based loans, further encouraging the shift toward yuan-based transactions. China's ability to provide both technological hardware and financial tools made it an increasingly attractive partner for governments seeking independence from Western systems. Russia adopted a complementary strategy. While China focused on digital infrastructure and manufacturing, Moscow concentrated on energy, arms trade, and resource-based partnerships. Countries that relied heavily on Russian oil, gas, or defense equipment found themselves naturally integrated into alternative financial arrangements that avoided Western oversight. Even nations that maintained good relations with the United States quietly explored these options, cautious of becoming vulnerable to sanctions or geopolitical pressure. This evolving system made it increasingly difficult for Washington to maintain its traditional role as the global financial and technological center. The U.S. still held enormous strengths: innovation, top-tier universities, leading tech companies, and a robust financial market. but it now faced a world that was gradually diversifying away from its influence. Inside the United States, debates intensified. Policymakers questioned whether the existing model was sustainable. Some argued that heightened export controls and sanctions were necessary to protect national interests. Others worried that such measures accelerated the development of independent foreign alternatives, which in turn weakened America's long-term strategic position. Silicon Valley, once the uncontested heart of global technology, found itself increasingly concerned about losing access to the Chinese market, which represented billions of dollars in annual revenue. Meanwhile, financial institutions warned that de-dollarization, even if slow, posed risks to America's economic stability. Reduced global demand for dollars could eventually raise borrowing costs, impact government spending, and shift investment flows toward emerging financial hubs. Though these changes would not happen overnight, they hinted at a future in which the United States might no longer enjoy the same economic privileges it once took for granted. Internationally, nations watched this shifting balance with mixed emotions. Some embraced the new reality, seeing it as an opportunity to diversify alliances and reduce dependence on Western powers. Others worried that a multipolar world could increase volatility, making global markets more unpredictable and increasing the risk of sudden economic shocks. What became evident, however, was that the world was no longer operating within a single unified system. Instead, it was slowly forming into a mosaic of overlapping networks, each influenced by different economic models, political goals, and technological standards. The competition for technological superiority, financial independence, and strategic influence was shaping the global order in ways not seen since the end of the Cold War. At the center of this transformation remained the ongoing semiconductor rivalry. Whether through AI development, military modernization, or digital infrastructure, chips continued to dictate which nations gained strategic advantage. The United States, determined to hold its lead, issued new regulations, funded domestic manufacturing projects, and strengthened international alliances. China, unwilling to slow its ambitions, invested even more aggressively in research, talent development, and high-tech industries. The rivalry extended far beyond simple economic competition. It represented two fundamentally different visions of the future. One vision centered on open markets, globalized supply chains, and dollar-based systems. The other centered on self-reliance, regional integration, and financial independence from the West. For many nations, the question was no longer which side they supported, but which system offered the most security, stability, and opportunity in an uncertain world. The stage was set for the next phase of this historic transformation, a phase where technological races, currency realignments, and geopolitical strategy all converged, shaping a future defined by competing systems rather than a single dominant power. As the global landscape continued to evolve, one thing became increasingly clear. The competition unfolding between the United States, China, and Russia was not a temporary geopolitical episode. It was the early foundation of a long-term transformation that would influence the world for generations. What started as a series of policy disputes over semiconductors and financial access had grown into a structural shift that touched nearly every aspect of the international system. Nations around the world, from major powers to small developing economies, began reassessing their strategies for survival and growth. In a future shaped by technological rivalry and financial fragmentation, the old rules no longer guaranteed stability. To navigate this environment, countries needed flexibility, diversified alliances, and the ability to operate across multiple systems. Some embraced new partnerships, while others cautiously balanced between competing forces, hoping to avoid being drawn into a confrontation that was becoming increasingly complex. Meanwhile, corporations, particularly in the tech and financial sectors, found themselves adapting to a reality where global integration could no longer be taken for granted. Boardrooms across Silicon Valley, Europe, and Asia were forced to rethink sourcing strategies, supply chains, and long-term investments. A single disruption in semiconductor supplies, a new regulation on export controls, or a shift in cross-border payment systems could determine the fate of entire industries. Innovation, once the driving force of a globally connected market, now had to be pursued within the boundaries of geopolitical tension. The growing divide between technological ecosystems had profound consequences. Nations aligned with the United States continued relying on Western digital infrastructure, software standards, and advanced chips. Those leaning toward China gained access to a rapidly expanding ecosystem of domestic alternatives, from AI processors to 5G platforms, along with financial systems designed to function independently from Western institutions. Russia strengthened its position by integrating deeper into the Eastern digital and financial world, ensuring that Western sanctions would never again isolate its economy the way they once did. Despite these shifts, the United States remained a formidable force. Its research institutions, technological achievements, and global influence continued to shape the world. American companies led the way in AI, cloud computing, cybersecurity, and semiconductor design. Its alliances, though tested, still represented some of the world's most powerful economies, and the dollar, despite growing challenges, continued to dominate international markets. China and Russia, however, were equally determined. China viewed technological independence as essential to national survival, pushing forward with unprecedented investments and long-term strategies. Russia, hardened by years of sanctions, embraced a future where self-sufficiency was not just advantageous, but necessary. Together, they built a shared framework designed to reduce reliance on Western systems and create new pathways for global exchange. This shifting balance of power did not signify an immediate collapse of the old order. Rather, it marked the gradual rise of a new one. A world where multiple financial systems coexisted, where semiconductor industries were split across competing blocks, and where countries had to navigate a strategic landscape more unpredictable than anything seen in decades. For the first time in generations, global leadership was truly up for contest. The coming years would determine how far this divergence would go. Would China reach full semiconductor independence? Would Russia and China successfully merge their payment networks into a seamless non-dollar financial system? Would nations in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia embrace these alternatives on a wide scale? And most importantly, how would the United States adapt to a world where its traditional tools of influence no longer guaranteed dominance? Analysts agree that the answers to these questions will shape the 21st century. The struggle for technological control and financial autonomy is already redefining alliances, redrawing economic boundaries, and setting the stage for a new era of competition. One fought not with tanks and missiles, but with chips, algorithms, rare minerals, and digital currencies. The global order is no longer standing still. It is shifting, slowly, steadily, and undeniably, toward a world where power is distributed across multiple centers. A world where nations must make strategic choices that will define their futures. And a world where the balance of power will be determined not only by military strength or economic size, but by who controls the technologies and financial systems that underpin modern civilization. As this transformation unfolds, one thing is certain. The next chapter of global history will be written not by those who follow the old rules, but by those who innovate boldly, adapt quickly, and understand that the true currency of power in the modern age is the ability to shape the systems that the world depends on.